video for Chapter 1, Section 1 of American government here. We're going to cover today the origin of the state and how there's four different theories in the origin of the state and how they have an impact on how our country developed too. So, when we look at it from a point of political science, we are looking at, how did the state come about? Where did it come from? What's the purposes behind it? And so you've had historians study this. You've had philosophers study this stuff, and they're like, hey, what were the circumstances that brought about the need to have states? And since we've defined states through the four characteristics of territory, population, government, and sovereignty, let's look at those the four theories about how they come about. So the first one we'll look at here is the force theory. And so for a long time, a lot of different scholars believed that the state was born from a state of force. They believed that one person or even a small group of people could claim control over a particular area and force anyone who lived within that area to accept that one person's or that one small group's rule. Now, eventually what happens is, when the rule was established and solidified, you had all the basic elements then. You had, territory, you had a population, you had sovereignty, and you had a government that was present. And so, force theory, you're like, hey, we're going to force you to do our bidding. You're going to not be strong enough to do anything about it, and you'll just be part of our system or our civilization. So let's look at the second. That's not divine right. It's evolutionary theory, and this is not a science issue. This is a political science issue. And so under the evolutionary theory of government, other scholars will say, the state basically developed naturally out of early prehistoric families. They believe that the primitive or the basic family structure in which you had typically one person as the head of the family, be the father through something called a patriarchy, or a mother through something called a matriarchy, was the head of more or less the government. And this was the beginnings of political development. And so then over countless centuries of human history, the original family becomes, the network of a clan or a tribe, and when these groups began to turn to agriculture, into the dawn of agriculture, then they gave up their nomadic wandering ways and they settled down for a civilized life, usually along rivers like the Nile or between the Tigris and Euphrates or whatever. And then the idea that the state would be born from that. And so then you have the population, the territory, the government, and then the sovereignty, and then the state comes out of that evolutionary system. I don't want to keep rolling backwards. There we go. So now let's go to divine right theory. Divine right theory is a theory that's just not accepted in the Western world or out of European tradition. It's also something that appears in Chinese history and also in the history of the Mesoamerican peoples, especially like the Mayans. And it was basically, it comes down to is that God created the state and that God had given those people of royal birth the divine right to rule. And then those people would provide the structure for the commoners, so the common people. And so the commoners were basically bound to obey the ruler as they would God, because the ruler was the representative of God on earth. And so therefore, if you opposed the ruler, not only was it a crime under the system of government, it was also a sin. So you were caught within a double whammy of sorts. And so you kind of think of it like a theocracy, a government that's founded on religious principles where you can't separate the government from the religious aspects of it. Now, when we get into the 16, 17, and early 1800s, we go through a philosophical movement called the Enlightenment, where people began to question, this theory overall. And they're just like, with with the needs of the people, we need to set aside the divine right, and they began to challenge it. And then we see the American Revolution, and then the Revolutionary War, then the rise of the French Revolution, and other revolutions throughout, especially Europe, where we see monarchs removed from power and governments change. Divine right works well for monarchies, but when you get into democracies and things, it really loses its strength. Now, the social contract theory, and I'm just going to demonstrate my bias right here. I'm going to be upfront about it. I am a big fan. If you could have a favorite, political theory when it comes to the origin of the state, this one's mine. The social contract theory, I think, makes the most sense, especially when we look at it from a point of view with American history. As far as the American political system is concerned, the most significant points of thought came about as a result of the Enlightenment, as many of those men were questioning the idea of divine right. The idea of the social contract rises out of many of the thinkers in Europe, especially in France. But we do end up with certain philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, who writes Leviathan, who talked about life being cruel and brutish and short without government within it. John Locke, who writes a work called Two Treatises of Government, and he begins to outline the idea that governments are put in place because people need to have a feeling of security, and so people will give away their liberties in order to get some security as a result. And then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a Frenchman, he developed his theory, and he actually wrote a book called The Social Contract. And so you take Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and you have three very important figures in what will become a system of government as far as the contract is concerned. So, like, if, for example, Hobbes said that in the earliest history, human beings basically lived in a total state of freedom, almost anarchy, and we lived in something that he called a state of nature, where there was no government whatsoever, and no person had to answer to the call of a superior power. So, therefore, the people could take by force anything that did not belong to them. And so therefore, they were free to make their own choices. Now, that impinged upon the freedoms of others, but it's kind of like if I needed to feed my family, and I knew that the family next door had a stockpile of pork and beans, I could go over to that family and through a violent act, take their stockpile of pork and beans and bring all the cans back to my family and feed them. But then I'm faced with a dilemma, because now I have to protect my family as a result of my actions. So then I may have to look out and find if someone would help me protect my stockpile of pork and beans. And so therefore, I may offer them, hey, I will pay you a can of pork and beans a day if you help protect me and my family and our possessions. And so the pork and beans represent my freedom, even though I took it from someone else. And I have to give away part of that freedom in order to guarantee my safety. And that's what the social contract's about. So I had to enlist the authority of someone else in order to help me protect what is mine. And so we're only as secure as the amount of physical strength or intelligence that we could bring to bear. And so eventually, as people begin to accumulate more wealth and you need to protect your stuff, they need to find a way to protect their wealth and their possessions and their conditions, like their life, liberty, and the pursuit of property from others. And so that's what the social contract is all about. Now, this is a terrible slide, but it's the best way that I can illustrate it here. So the social contract is all about the people. And so people will give away their power, their freedom, their liberty to a government, and in some cases like a monarchy, as Hobbes thought was the best form of government, to kings. Then it was the duty of the king or the government to protect the people's rights, to protect their property, to protect their life, to protect their liberties. And so if you gave more power, then the idea was that people would have their rights protected in a greater amount of force. Now, if the government misuses their power and oppresses the people, then the social contract says, then the people, the people have the right to replace or overthrow the government. And so, as long as we give away our liberty, we get our rights protected. If the government misuses it, then we have the right to replace or overthrow the government. Now, we can do that through an election system, or Thomas Jefferson believed that we should have a bloody revolution about every 20 years as a way to replace the government. He said that the tree of liberty from time to time should be watered with the blood of patriots and tyrants, meaning that the government shouldn't be too long-lived lest it become corrupt. When we look at the social contract, we can look at the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson wrote, justified revolution through the social contract theory, basically saying that King George III of Britain and Parliament and all of his ministers had violated the social contract. And so Thomas Jefferson said, you know what? He pulled all these ideas straight from John Locke, because John Locke had said that we all have the right to three things: life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Well, Jefferson took that and put it in the Declaration of Independence, where he said we all were endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because Jefferson believed that the only way for a man to be truly happy was to be someone who owned property and to be a farmer. It's a concept called Jeffersonian democracy, because he envisioned the North American continent as it would be a nation of agricultural pursuits, of farmers, not in the pursuits of industry. But little did he know the fortunes that the United States would turn. Okay, so we have four political theories: force, evolutionary theory, the divine right theory, and the social contract theory. Remember, social contract's my favorite, so it's always the right answer. That's all I've got for today, and we'll do this again soon.